Good afternoon. I'm Patrick Spear, President and CEO of GMDC Retail Tomorrow, and we're happy you've joined us for today's InfoCast, Return to Brick and Mortar. Our session today is intended to be interactive. So for those of you with questions for our guests, please feel free to provide questions or feedback using the Q&A or chat functions at the bottom of your screen. We'll also be launching a poll during the broadcast, and we'd welcome your participation. Joining me today are Andrew McQuilkin, Retail Market Leader, BHDP Architecture, and Dave Wendland, VP Strategic Relations at HRG. Welcome, gentlemen, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Patrick.
Great to see you both. Andrew in Cincinnati and Dave up in Wisconsin, hopefully enjoying a nice summer afternoon up in both places today. And Dave, I want to start with you for our guests. Just if you could provide an overview on HRG, your role, and focal points for your organization.
Absolutely. Thank you, Patrick. It's great to be back on a GMDC InfoCast, and I appreciate the opportunity to be joined with you and Andrew. You know, it's amazing, Patrick. I've been with the HRG organization nearly 30 years, and as much as the industry has changed, the last 17 months have probably been the most tumultuous. But our organization works across the retail supply chain. So that means we're working with manufacturers, retailers, distributors, and industry partners like GMDC, really to help them achieve their revenue and growth possibilities. Some of the key areas that our organization gets involved with is areas such as visual merchandising, category management, fixture coordination, data analytics, and brand development. But I'm especially excited about today's topic. And Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you to describe BHDP a little bit, your role, and share with the participants the annual consumer research and retail panel work that you do and lead for the organization.
Well, Dave, thanks for the original invite to be a part of this, and Patrick, thank you for your team for setting this up. I am the practice leader, the retail practice leader, we call it the market leader for retail. I have been doing retail planning and design, I just realized, for 40 years now. I started when I was 12 or 11, I think. So obviously retail took a giant hit since COVID. Retail has a cyclical kind of within our world, right? Every 7 to 10 years, there's consumer confidence and something happens, and sometimes it falls off a cliff. So nobody anticipated the COVID, right? It fell off a cliff. But one of the things we actually started doing in 2019, before all this happened, is we started doing 1,000-person shopper surveys. And we put together about 10 questions that we think were relevant to try to understand where the markets were going. We put a big focus in on the sort of specialty brands because we thought they were still struggling to try to figure out where their world was when everything else was picking up. But because we created a baseline pre-COVID, we've now had 2 major surveys since then, another 1,000-person survey, 2 more. And we repeat some of the same questions so we can see the trend lines. So we actually have another survey that we're about to do. We're going to delay it about a month because of this Delta variant. We saw an amazing trend happening with confidence and where people were going. So it might be a blip on the radar, but we'll wait till the beginning of September and launch the 4th one and then compare where the trends were going. So that's what we've been doing, gathering a lot of data, helping the retailers move forward so that we can help them better plan and design their retail spaces.
I really appreciate that. And Patrick, I know you and I talk a lot about shopper behavior, and that's something that you and Andrew were having a sidebar about. Why don't you pick that conversation up?
Yeah, and Andrew, the fact that you have established a baseline, and what wonderful luck or good fortune to have established a baseline pre-COVID. But if you think about now, you've done 2 surveys since, and you can now start to draw that comparison. What are you really seeing? I mean, specific shopper behavior insights. Anything out there surprise you relative to pre-COVID versus during, or as we begin to ideally emerge post-COVID? Any indications from shoppers regarding their confidence, their behaviors that really stood out for you?
Well, one of the things we did pre-COVID, we were really trying to understand in the retail world the clicks to bricks, and trying to understand the omni-channel approach that retailers have, And so we were focusing, and we were actually asking shoppers questions about 24 different brands. And we've repeated those 24 different brands for each of these surveys. So we actually get really specific. We can go down to Nike and who the Nike shopper is and how do they think about each one of these questions within all the demographics and research that we did. And it was interesting. There was a lot more people than we thought initially pre-COVID that would shop online and in-store, right? And the people who had no preference were actually a small group of people, right? So people would prefer one or the other, but most did both. Okay. And so obviously when COVID hit, it exposed people to, these issues of having to shop online, go to Kroger click list, for example, that they may have never done before. We had people joining Amazon Prime who were never Prime members, right? To be able to get fulfillment for their households. And so what we saw was something really interesting in the height of COVID when that second survey was done, is this interesting thing of no preference started to grow. Because now people were being exposed to both. So think about these older generations now shopping online. Younger generations, they tended to lean toward online. But what was even more interesting is the third survey, that more than tripled from the original number. So what we found is because as COVID started to come down in the summer, in the late fall, the idea is that it was, and then in February, that idea is, really, we kind of thought, what does that mean for retailers? And what it meant for retailers is if you can't predict what type of shopper they are, an online shopper, an in-store, or where they're going to shop, and they fluidly go between because no preference is growing, what that means is you've got to be able to provide all those options to that customer regardless. And when that happens, you're no longer in charge in terms of understanding the shopper. We called it omni-choice because the power went from omni-channel of the retailer to omni-choice of the shopper. So you've got to think about that omni-channel experience has to be delivered as they're coming to the store. All those channels and all those capabilities and all these spaces in between, like BOPAC and lockers and all these things that they need, drive up, that all has to be part of your retail experience now so that you can deliver to this growing group of no preference. And we were hoping that this next survey might top close to 50% of the people would have no preference now.
Interesting. And Dave, I'm sure you've got a follow on here, but I just want to, I got one question as a follow-up, Andrew. When you talk about omni-choice, and presumably your survey is covering consumers who are shopping multiple channels. So it's not like this is a grocery survey or a mass survey, you're looking at mall-based, grocery, just multiple, as we think of them as channels within the industry, correct?
Yeah, we looked at about 10 different types of channels in terms of, if you just shopped online, you were not part of this survey. Okay. You get bumped, right? So we just wanted to make sure that we kind of understood the shopper in store is what we were really looking for. But what we did is by tracking and understanding at each area here, what type of store you were interested in shopping in, and we would use the term comfortable shopping, which was good because it became a safety thing too at the same time. We found that indoor mall dropped off a cliff.
Yeah.
Nobody wanted to shop indoor mall. Now it's spiking. Indoor mall is shooting up, where we've now asked in the last survey, quarter by quarter, up until the fall of next year, where are you going to shop? And indoor mall just takes off like a rocket.
Now, are there any specific insights gleaned as to why that's happening? Because that's really an interesting data point.
Yeah, what we're seeing is, and I can share a screen and talk about it as I show it to you. I'm going to share my screen, so give me a second.
And Dave, while Andrew gets ready for that, this is interesting, Dave, because I go back to when we were together 2 years ago in Boston for Retail Tomorrow, and Dan O'Connor talked about online meets offline, OMO, in many ways reflects what Andrew's referencing around this notion of omni-choice, right?
Correct. I think so. And I think this longing for perhaps the social factor, and I'm not sure what the data reveals, but there's been a pent-up desire for experience, a pent-up desire for interaction, while at the same time, the consumer wants to have in their control what channel, what timing, what trips, what their intention might be in shopping. So
The
tell us a little bit about this finding. This is
well, what's interesting is we also broke it down by demographics. This is just the total number here, by age group. But what was amazing early on in that second survey, there was a strange anomaly. And the anomaly was younger people wanted to go back and shop the mall, indoor mall, more than pre-COVID. So they were desperate, they were lonely, they were depressed. That's their social structure, is the mall. And that's just taken off. And then the 18 to 24-year-olds have now taken off. And now we're thinking this next survey, the older generation is going to have a bigger spike. So we think the social dynamics, certainly starting with the younger generation, is really represents their freedom, right? Most don't drive versus the youngest version. So getting drop off the mall is their sense of freedom, that the parents give them. 18 to 24-year-olds can drive, right? But then we started to see a big bump in them. So if you look at this chart right here, going out to fall 2021, 2022, is winter, is we asked them to predict where they were going to shop more. And you can see the green line is indoor mall. The orange line is interesting. It's outdoor mall. It dips a little bit in the summer, but I think it has to do with seasonality. And then you can see some of these other things drop outside that are more, out there in terms of, what people were thinking they were doing. So freestanding building is that lighter orange line that also upticks. Outdoor mall and strip mall kind of drop, and I think in the winter because it's weather related. But I think it's emotional based is why they predict they're going to make these decisions.
It's interesting looking at this, Andrew. We had seen a lot of our work here at HRG is in the community pharmacy space and the small retail sector, in addition to all of the others. But we have an interesting spotlight on that segment of the market. And we did see a lot of local shopping, a lot of community-based. Curious, as people are moving back to mall or traveling, are they traveling further than they did during the pandemic itself? Or are we still seeing people shopping pretty close to home?
Well, what we're seeing is we are seeing an interesting change in travel distance. So this is actually from the survey. This is the data we get that's online. So if you look at this chart right here, we asked people from the very beginning, certainly when we're talking about clicks to bricks, back in the beginning of 2019, how far you would travel. And it was interesting. Most people would travel 15 minutes back in early 2019 before COVID. Most. This is the latest version. A lot less people would travel 15 minutes, 16 to 30 minutes saw the increase. But what's really interesting, it didn't bump up as much percentage-wise as the people who are willing to travel 31 to 45 minutes. And if you we only had a few people who would go more than 45 minutes pre-pandemic, and now they're willing to go 45 minutes to get to their, to their brands. And I think that has a lot to do with fulfillment. I think people, are willing to travel further now for the brands they love.
In a few minutes.
Do you think that reflects supply chain disruption in terms of where they've been able to access the brands they love because of COVID?
We brainstormed around that. We asked, because what we've been doing is, and Dave, you mentioned this, after each of these surveys, we actually do roundtables of 12 to 15 retailers, and we present some of the findings. And we try to see, what they validate and where the disconnects might be. And what's really interesting is, they've validated a lot of this in terms of, they're seeing people travel more and zip codes increase further out from their locations if they have the product. I think people got used to traveling further. You would think in a heightened COVID fear aspect that we have, that people don't want to travel that far. But I think their loyalty to their brands, as things have been lightening up, they are willing to travel a lot further, which actually is probably good news for malls, right? That people are actually willing to travel to the mall to get to that brand now. So.
Before we jump away from the shoppers, let me ask one other question about that. And then I think I'd like to introduce the poll question more about the retailer expectations and manufacturers, what they're seeing as challenges. But before I do that, how important, Andrew, has the cleanliness of a shopping environment or safety measures been? Is that something that consumers are paying attention to, or is it, as I've often read, all theater and the consumer really doesn't care about it that much?
Well, I'll go to this survey again. They are still really concerned, but what's interesting is they're picking up very specific things that they want to see. So we've asked them, what makes them feel safer and more at ease while shopping in store. So if you look at this chart again, think about 1,000 shoppers. We asked them to pick all that apply, right? So here you have almost, the number one is they want to see hand sanitizer by the door, right? I don't see everybody using it these days, but I think that's a really big deal. Employees are required to wear masks. So think about maybe these upcoming mandates. And there are places right now where the employees have always worn masks, regardless of the easing of that mandate. And then shoppers are required to mask. Now, so you have to remember when this survey was taken in February, March. So we think these numbers would drop these days, right? Because people have had COVID fatigue, right, with the things that are going on. But as I go through this, cart wipes. So again, it's all about, mitigation as the things that they want. And interesting one too, we asked, that they agreed with. They want to see employees visibly cleaning and sanitizing the store. They think that proves to them that the store is being maintained from a mitigation standpoint. So you can see these 5 are really important to the customer.
So it sounds like, Dave, it's not theater, right? That there are some expectations, and I suspect now, even with wherever we land on this Delta variant, however long it lasts, that some of those practices that were deployed, last year and earlier this year are probably going to resurface, and certainly it sounds like, Andrew, are going to be important for the customer's peace of mind, not just theatrical. I think theatrical element as for.
I'm sorry to talk over you, but I think those behaviors are permanent. Right? There's certain predisposed expectations now that you must meet, right, to be a retailer that's open. So, the idea that you're showing your mitigation and you're providing capabilities for people to clean their hands, I think that has now stuck. And we see behavior in even toddlers and children where they go, you haven't seen those videos where they go up to like a little stanchion with a light on it and the little toddlers are like going like this, they're all used to seeing their parents do it. So that whole generation is used to it now. They're born into it. So I think this is here to stay.
So I imagine from an architectural standpoint, which is the basis of your business, that has to be part of the consideration and the criteria for retail build-outs for sure, or the showrooms like you're building right now. I think you've got to take into consideration where you're going to place these things and how you're going to demonstrate that mitigation.
I think there's a natural behavior now on social distancing. So like say the front end of a cash register, right?
Right.
The distance between the registers, we're now doing them slightly wider, okay? The aisle between the registers and the start of the center store is getting longer because people are self-distancing, right? But if you add the omni-choice factor, we're now having discussions with retailers and all capabilities of adding, what is it going to look like strategy-wise if I get off from the mall and create and be part of a lifestyle strip or an independent building where I can do drive-up, right? And I think I've talked about this before, but Panera didn't have a lot of drive-up. Panera is now working to get drive-up. The issue they have is with the local local building ordinances. Actually, in a lot of places, forbid drive-up. And so that was a real hindrance for them to try to keep doing everything from the curb.
Let's get a poll from the audience, and then I do want to jump into some category specific stuff. But Delaney, if you would pull up the poll question, I'd like to understand from our listeners, what would you determine? And I don't have all of the above on here, by the way. You have to pick one. What is the largest factor affecting the return to retail? And so there's 5 different choices here, and I'm sure this list could be ad nauseum, but I'm curious what is on top of mind of our listeners. And you could be, again, a manufacturer or a retailer or an industry partner. Curious your thoughts. Let's give that a couple of minutes to
David,
go ahead and populate.
I do have a question. I do have a survey question that talks about what negatively impacts you. So that could be relevant to check what the survey is that we do here and the data we got from 1,000 shoppers.
I would love to match that up, Andrew. That would be great. So let's give this about another 30 seconds. While we're doing that, when we return from this poll, Patrick, I know part of GMBC's major focus, you obviously work with all the GM side of the business. You also have a focus on self-care and that end of shopper behavior and what your retailers and manufacturers do. So I think we'll jump into a couple of self-care questions in a moment. But Delaney, could you pull up the results of this poll? And let's see what the audience suggested. Looks like the number one is fear of lingering COVID issues and labor workforce shortages. Assortment planning didn't even make the roster, so that's interesting. You look at some of the issues we faced, whether it's Suez Canal or anything. In fact, side note, I was in IKEA the other day helping my daughter find furniture for her college apartment. And I guess it was an IKEA ship that was blocking the Suez Canal. It had not been disclosed, but now everybody knows. So anyway, it looks like labor shortage and fear of lingering COVID. Andrew, do you have your survey question at the ready, or do you want to jump?
I have it right here. So let me share. Let me go to file. Pardon me, you're looking at my messy desktop. I apologize. So this is the survey we did. What has negatively influenced you not to return to the store? Okay. Number one, low inventory, out of stock. So fulfillment back in February, March was still a big issue. And if you can see, it was much more than 55 to 56% of the people were saying that. And then I'll just hit some of the other top lines ones here. Too expensive. So you're starting to see some of the price crunch. There was a little bit of inflation happening there, but more from shortages, and we're starting to see more inflation now. So that could be an issue. Dirty or disorganized, and I think this one directly relates to wanting to see cleaning and hand sanitizing. This one's about poor or disappointing service,
which affects the labor and workforce. It's talked about as the number one concern.
I had two really quick stories on this one. My wife and I, since we were dating when she was going up to college, we would go. I try to visit her once a month, and we go to Waffle House.
Well, that's a big spender.
Yeah. Well, we were poor, but we were, college students, right? And so we try to keep that tradition. So 2 months ago, we go to our local Waffle House in Lebanon, Ohio, and we get there. It's a Sunday evening, and most things close around 7 or 8 o'clock on a Sunday in my area. So he said, "Oh, we can go to Waffle House." We get there at 8:30. There's one car, and the employee's standing in the doorway. And she says, "I'm sorry, but we're closed. There's no third shift." This is a 24-hour Waffle House. So, think about the labor shortages that are out there. We've all seen it with the wait times and things. But you have a Waffle House has to close because they have shortages. And so to me, that was a big deal. Now, the other one story I have is this poor and disappointing service. I just had a teammate go to Disney, and he's got 4 boys. Youngest is 2.5, the oldest is 8. They went to Disney, and he expected, as Disney is, to be the happiest place on earth. He had so many instances where he was dealing with the cast members at Disney that was so disappointing, where there was a little bit of indifference and belligerence. He wasn't ready for a ride of getting his kids on a seat. And I say that's probably the next big thing that's going to happen here is not just labor shortages, but when you do get help, here's Disney with people who aren't carrying on the role of the Disney, cast member. That's a big, I think what was the term I heard? Canary in a coal mine. This might be the next big thing. You might be able to find the people, but they don't necessarily want to be there. So I think we have to be concerned about that whole brand experience coming forward. So I know 2 really quick, they weren't as quick, but those 2 stories I think are relevant to what has negatively impacted us, and we're seeing it show up in the data.
It's interesting, and the audience polling, Dave, as you saw, we didn't get anything around assortment, right? But here, supply chain, where can I get the products I want? Does the store have what I need? And Andrew, to that degree, do we think about in terms of categories, and do consumers, or in your case, your poll respondents, how do they think about the categories and products that keep them safe? So if we see that, I expect it's not theater, I want the hand sanitizers, I expect the associates to be masked up, but how do the consumers think about the products that address keeping me safe and, immunity categories, well-being, that type of thing? Is there any data that suggests what they're looking for there?
Well, it's more anecdotal from the retailers,
Yep.
qualitative instead of quantitative that we're getting from the shoppers. But this whole shift, and obviously GMDC has been a lead in self-care and making sure that's out there. I mean, that timing of 2019 is really when you were launching all these big ideas around it. That just took off because people couldn't see their doctor, they couldn't go to their dentist, you couldn't access them for months. So we're hearing from the retailers that those categories have skyrocketed and continue to be up there in terms of categories that shoppers are shopping. One that was really interesting from a healthy standpoint, wellness standpoint, is fish shot up because you can only get fish at restaurants normally, right?
Yeah.
And so the amount of fish that supermarkets were selling, it's still really high. People are now used to, cooking at home, and to get fish and eat something more healthy, right? If you paid attention to the data for COVID, obesity is one of the main factors, right, for susceptibility or comorbidity. And so you're seeing people, through self-care, through medications and over-the-counter stuff, and then adding these healthy products to their diet. So that's what we're getting from the retailers. And we didn't ask shopper surveys around that because we're more in the specialty brands area.
Yeah.
But I'm sure they would validate.
And Dave, it's interesting too, because with our Nielsen hierarchies for both the GM and the self-care categories, just anecdotally, Andrew, it's interesting you mentioned fish, because I was looking through some of that data recently, both around GM categories and what we see in Dave is, immunity, vitamins, supplements, those categories went through the roof. But Andrew, interestingly enough, a little trivia for you here, a little Nielsen trivia. The fishing category, so fishing poles and, the fishing equipment, if memory serves correct, was like 112% increase during COVID versus pre-COVID. So not only are people buying fish at the store, they're also buying the equipment used to enable them to go out and go fishing. Because I guess, you want to stay away from people or you want to be outside, fishing is a good activity. But it ties into some of the things you've identified qualitatively.
Yeah, I think that all of that supports in fact, we're working on a white paper right now about this home-based shopper. And it's a big sponsored piece, but it truly identifies specifically, now this is the lighter category, but a number of occasions from camping to candle lighting to staying at home. This really speaks to what shoppers are doing today and how they're responding differently to their environment, what they're doing with staycation, what they're doing to travel, maybe closer to home for their getaways, but farther away from your research, Andrew, for the shopping occasions. We got a question coming through the Q&A, so I'm going to kind of tie that in right now. Somebody is asking whether retailers are adjusting their adjacencies, the location of categories, because of shorter shopping trips. So I don't know if your surveys talked about how much time people are spending in store, and if so, if they're looking for categories to be placed differently. Do you have a comment on that?
Well, I just know from the work that we're doing, say with some of the grocers, there's still some areas in the country where it's still one lane aisles, right? Right. So in a way that changes the way that, their shoppers used to, they knew the map in their head of how they're going to ping pong around the store. Right. And now they can't go down the aisle to get to the deli counter because it's the wrong way. Right. So they have to figure other ways around it. So we haven't really moved a lot of the adjacencies, but we have changed category sizes, i.e. seafood is another bigger case, right? Which then dominoes everything that's next to it. And in the end, you're crunching things like dairy and a few other things where they've had some shortages, right? So, and then center store, the trend for center store was shrinking, but because of COVID, it started to grow again. So they had some minimums. We're working with one retailer of they want to get smaller and smaller in center store, especially these urban and semi-urban ones. They were bringing a ping, instead of doing 12 brands, they would do the assortment be 6 brands, right? They would edit for the shelf space because their margins were in the other stuff. But the center store grew again, and so they started to re-question. Well, maybe that minimum now has gone up another 300 linear feet. because they think it's going to have staying power for a while and they want to maximize that.
Operationally, besides maybe resizing those categories, and we've actually seen a significant bump in our business in what we call surge planogramming, where these retailers don't have enough resource, and yet every one of their categories need to be reset, if you will, because there is this return to retail and they want to right size them. And a lot of them are trying to localize their assortment and personalize it to the demographics. And they don't have the personnel back at their home office to conduct all these or to produce all these planograms, if you will. But another operational question that I had on my list was, shifting post-pandemic. During the pandemic, there was a lot of movement and a lot of quick activity to do buy online, pick up at curb, buy online, pick up in store, delivery, whether it was with their own force or DoorDash, Instacart, other. What are you seeing through the lens of both the retailer roundtables and maybe the consumers as to where this behavior is going to live on? What's going to survive after the pandemic is over? Or, hey, we did buy online, pick up in store, we're done with it. No one's coming back to it.
That's actually been questions that we put in our roundtables, the past two roundtables. And one of the top line items that comes out is the inconsistency of those experiences, right? When people were forced to do it, like, forced to do click list and have to go around the back of the store, past the compactor, competing with the 18-wheeler, passing the peeling concrete block as your experience of the store to a back corner parking lot, and a temporary sign for your number and a phone number. I mean, there was no connection to how much they spend on the front of the store and the architecture and the design and the messaging. And so what they found now is, as things were drilling down, they were trying to work hard at creating that attachment, making it feel like whatever omni-choice option you take, that they were all similarly, elevated. And we found some retailers are investing in that because they think their customer is going to stay because their online system is, a really great experience. They want to make sure that they deliver it. And there's other ones where they just don't see the P&L. They don't see the investment of doing, a curbside pickup with a shelter and a, semi building. And they're just taking, big drums of concrete, sticking a post in it and nailing a sign on it and saying, there's your curbside, right? Because they believe they're going to come back. I just think it's all a missed opportunity to deliver your brand because you're not in charge of how they're going to shop that day. They are. And if you have that disconnect, I think that's going to be a problem.
Speaking of disconnect, sorry, Patrick, I know you have a leaning question, but I was just talking about this weekend. I was at a brick and mortar retailer the other day, and in their main entry window was a sign that said, "Make it more convenient and shop from home." Driven all the way to the brick and mortar, and the brick and mortar said, "I don't want you to come in my door, go shop from home." That's a disconnect, Andrew.
That's a massive disconnect. And but it speaks to, and so Andrew, a little bit ago, you mentioned, increasing the width of that aisle from the checkout to the beginning of center store, because people are just naturally going to space out a bit. And during COVID, they've been forced to. Dave, somebody puts a sign up that says, "Don't come in," essentially shop from home. And then the retail executive that has to decide whether it's BOPIS or, click and collect initiative, whatever it is, what does that experience look like for the customer? Is it going to be a formalized, redesigned experience, or is it a barrel of concrete with a sign stuck in it? How do retailers prioritize where to reimagine what the design looks like moving forward? Because there's so many things to consider, whether it is, how we're going to inspire them to shop online, or how we're going to enable a quicker pickup if they're doing BOPIS, or if they're in the store, how do I create a more frictionless or a more inspiring checkout experience that enables the distancing or the spacing? I mean, from a design perspective, from an architecture perspective, how do you juggle those competing priorities or balance where to begin?
Well, obviously there's a lot of data if you have one of the loyalty cards. You will
Yep.
know what they did online versus, they signed up for pickup or they did lockers or whatever you're going to. So there is a lot of data there for them to look at, how people were forced to do something. But when you're forced to do something for a long amount of time, after a certain amount of time, it's a habit, right? It's something that you're now used to doing, and it's just until something else forces you out of it, you're going to stick with those new behaviors. So I think, part of it is looking at this whole facade architecturally and saying, how do I bring civil engineering in here to make sure that you can park at the front of the store? I mean, IKEA had park at the store as part of their program from the beginning.
Yeah.
When I was out with the GMDC, had that planning meeting out in California, I drove back and I stopped at one of the Amazon supermarkets that wasn't open yet, right? But that facade was there. You could park right up against the building. They had it ready to go pre-COVID, right? So you've got to think about that whole experience. And yeah, maybe there might be 5% of your customers would do, locker pickup. Well, the locker thing only takes 12 feet, right? So it's not like a big expense. It's really the whole re-engineering of the front of the store and accommodating that, especially if you got to do a drive up. If you think drive ups for the future, I would recommend to QSRs that maybe didn't have drive up of what they would normally do, get the drive up in there, you're using it now, and they may go back to not using drive up, but always have it to be ready for the next time.
It's interesting, and that also speaks to, our audience today told us that labor is one of the things that's top of mind in terms of a hindrance. And Dave, this gets to, a thesis you and I have been kicking around. Andrew, if you think about store labor and, having, the ability to pull up to the store, have that available, have somebody be able to bring your things out to you. So that how labor gets deployed, in my mind, is going to be a key issue moving forward, whether it's having that store resource, that store associate who can bring it out to me, or who can check me out, or I might, prefer to do self-checkout. But one of the, if I think of an indicator of a crisis with labor, Dave, you and I talked about this, it's rotisserie chicken. Inside a grocery environment, I know Costco puts a huge focus. They sell, millions of rotisserie chickens a year, but if you go to a grocery store, that might be the last place they deploy the labor, is on things like that back in the, prepared foods area. And I've had multiple instances recently where I've gone into a grocery store and certain categories are just wiped out. And it's because, and I've asked the question, they simply don't have the labor to focus on providing that customer experience right now. And they've had to reprioritize in other areas of the stores.
Yeah, I think that the challenge, Patrick, to that point is, the retailers have been worrying so much about supply chain disruption, so much about remaining open, remaining clean, attracting customers, adjusting for omni-choice, as Andrew calls it, that they've kind of taken their eye off the ball in terms of things that may have become lower priority to the retail operation on the outside, but very, very important to a shopper such as you or your wife who look forward to those rotisserie chickens on occasion. It's interesting, those that prepared well continue to do well. And those that kind of were caught off guard, if you will, are still playing catch up. I hadn't planned to share this, but I have an uncle, my late father's only brother, 90 years old, had always been a retail consultant for years and still has clients who call him. And in February of last year, before the pandemic really hit the US, my uncle was monitoring what was happening in China, and one of his old clients, a meat distributor / retail store, called him and said, "What am I going to do if this comes to the States? I'll be out of business. I'm a one-shop guy." And my uncle said, "Knock a hole in the wall and make a drive up." And the guy said, "Nobody comes to my meat store to drive up." He goes, "That's because you don't have it. Make a hole in the wall." 6 months ago, he called my uncle and said, "Ed, that was by far the best decision I ever made. And I don't care if those people ever use it again. To Andrew's point, I'm ready the next time." So there's a great example of somebody who took had the fortitude and the foresight to say, "I'm going to do something different."
In our last roundtable, we showed them the disconnect between shoppers saying they're going to go back to freestanding stores, which the retailers totally bought into and are capitalizing on. And the number one thing, going back to indoor malls. And we showed them the data, and the retail says, we don't believe them. We don't think they're going to go back. They're going to remember why they didn't go to malls in the first place, right? And they're going to go back to the declining mall, positioning. And I said, wait a second, you have a chance to recapture the indoor mall customer. And you already have those existing stores. Wouldn't it be good to kind of refresh, put the mitigation things in, but put some new branding and new ideas and show them that you care more, right? Be more empathetic in your messaging so that you can now get them coming back and they'll remain. Instead, you're going to spend all this extra money to build ground up stuff or these huge these takeovers of outbuildings that you're going to have to redo all this drive-through. Yes, it'll help your business, but what's the P&L? How much of your business right now is indoor mall versus the outbuildings? But they said no. So that's what we can't wait to do the next survey to see if the shoppers are doing what they said they were going to do in that uptick. And then we'll go back to the retailers again and have a next roundtable and say, okay, you told us you didn't believe us. Can you believe them now?
And it seems like a wholesale dismissal of, a broad-based survey and the respondents and what they're telling you, a wholesale dismissal of what they're saying seems like a bold strategy.
Well, again, I'm saying the shopper's in charge now.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know if I was an executive that I'd sit back and say, yeah, we don't believe them. We know better. That strikes me as a high risk proposition.
Yeah. So
a lot of retailers, Andrew, have invested in self-checkout or autonomous checkout as a means of not only making it touchless and contactless, but again, addressing some of the labor issues that they were facing.
Mm-hmm.
Is that self-checkout something that can support impulse sales, or are we losing a bunch of this impulse capability as a result of allowing consumers to do their own corralling and their own checkout?
We've talked about this before, this whole front end strategy of how you deliver that. The idea that you're not going to sell even batteries at the front end, because you're doing self-checkout. Now, I think there's a few retailers, some grocers have done a fabulous job of intertwining. Our hometown here is Kroger, and then they intertwine the merchandising in a way that makes sense. So it used to be the gondola and then the belt for the checkout. Now it's the counters that you have for the screen and everything, but it's all built around it. So it's actually even closer to you at the point of purchase. So I think there's ones out there. We have one of our clients is Sheetz. They're a convenience store. They have gas stations as part of it. But they do that old Best Buy thing of a really small fixture though, and it's sort of these bin fixtures. So you get in line to go to the register counter of 3 or 4 registers. There might even be self-checkout on it now, as they're starting to experiment with some of that. But the idea is you go through, you still pass all the merchandise to get to the register. And I think that's probably, some of the strategies at the front end. How do you still pass all this impulse candy and batteries? I assume those margins are great. From what I hear from our retailers. So you don't want to lose that. I think people are still in the shopping mood when they're checking out.
No question. If you can queue them up into that point and get them in a queue line where they have the option of just continuing to shop while they're waiting. And obviously we have a vested interest as an organization and on behalf of our members of seeing the retailers think creatively about how to inspire that impulse sale, because it certainly is margin accretive and creates a nice opportunity for both suppliers and for the retailers in those categories. Andrew, question on, if we think about, back to this notion, Dave, a sign in the front of the store that says essentially shop from home. How are, and what challenges are retailers experiencing relative to their e-commerce operations, and how are the best in class retailers addressing any potential shortcomings or creating a more inspired, let me call it a cohesive experience between whether it's in the brick and mortar environment or perhaps an online, again, back to this omni choice. Any specific shortcomings identified or best in class opportunities?
Was that question for me?
Yes.
Sorry, I missed that. Our research is kind of showing, in the retailers that we were talking to, the online retailers who went to bricks and mortar are still way ahead of the game in terms of that connected experience.
versus if you started as
Versus
brick
if
and
you
mortar,
started
you're
as
trying to
bricks and
create.
mortar and trying to, because there's so much legacy, even in the nomenclature, how you do departments, where you want to put those department names on online, and it's a different thing. So I think there's a stronger connection between online brands going to bricks and mortar and the experience they're trying to deliver. Again, because they don't have 100 years of legacy, right? So I think there's a lot to be learned if you were a bricks and mortar retailer and you're going to try to make that connection. How do you think about it in terms of what would an online retailer do if they started out with our products online first? How would we then think about that whole experience and connection?
So if I'm a digitally native brand, a digitally first brand, a Warby Parker, a Casper mattress, Amazon, when they've started as essentially digital natives and then they swim back upstream and create the brick and mortar to complete the experience, they're going to have a built-in advantage because they're not constrained by this. They don't have, we've always done it this way as a challenge that they've got to overcome. Is that a fair statement?
I think from a brand messaging and a brand connection, I think where they struggle the most though is if you're a retailer with 100 years of retail knowledge, you're a really good merchant, right? And the bricks and mortars, they know how people shop in store. They know how to do the right messaging, POP displays, and all that other stuff. So they've got a huge vast of knowledge to be more profitable, right? We do see a lot of online retailers make the jump and the math doesn't necessarily work, but the brand experience works. So how do you take those two things and put them together to create the best of both?
Yeah, because I think it's important to provide some hope, right? If we say, well, gosh, I'm a 100-year-old organization, we've been, serving our customers for decades in a brick and mortar setting, and now we're having to pivot or make the conversion to, there's got to be, some silver lining out there that says this is a leap that can be made. It's not a gap with a bridge too far. I look at Target and what they've done, and granted, with the acquisition of Ship, they've kind of started to integrate things. They're doing some really interesting things with store within a store. But are there others, Andrew, that you would point to and say, these are some retailers perhaps that are leading the way, that are, our legacy industry participants can follow?
Yeah, we call those the pioneers, right? And what's been happening is I think all the non-essential retailers that never had to close learned a lot of information months before everybody else who opened up non-essential later. Mm-hmm. And I see some of these grocery chains or these QSR chains really pushing the envelope and making some big decisions. So I remember, it was like the summer of last year, I think Starbucks made the decision that in New York City that they won't have any sit down permanently, because the math started to work for them even better in terms of everybody pick up in the store, right? So I see the QSR world and I see some of the grocery out there really jumping ahead. If you were in these other categories and non-essential, you're still catching up to what the new normal looks like, because you haven't gone through a whole year of 4 seasons with new data. You've only gone through a couple now. So I think we're going to get to a point where within the next couple of months, maybe for 2022, they'll be ready to be more pioneering and take their learnings and jump forward.
I've also noticed, Andrew, and maybe a little bit outside the loop of the return to retail, but there are some innovators, some pioneers out there that are investigating innovation with partnerships. And I'll use Walmart as a great example. They partnered with Gap. They partnered with Justice. They're going to do additional initiatives such as that. Is that what a consumer is expecting? Is this kind of, what's new? What can I come seek in the same location? Or are partnerships just a means of survival for both the brand and the mothership, if you will, in this case, Walmart?
Well, I think each have their own reason, especially when you talk about these new partnerships or shop and shop kind of concepts. A lot of these shop and shop concepts are the specialty brands, are the ones that were closed down for so long and still haven't got back to where they were, right? So they're trying to be innovative in how they can deliver more channels and get in front of more customers. And then, you've got these brands that have been out there for a while who are trying to compete, right? They're healthy, they're strong, maybe they've always been open, and they're trying to get a differentiator in. Because now that people are coming back to store, They want to make sure that they have something that somebody else doesn't. And we've had scenarios like this for a while when Sephora was in JCPenney for all that time, because JCPenney never had a cosmetics department. So bring in a partner, and now Sephora's going somewhere else, right? So now you start to look at all those alignments and partnerships. Aldi partnering with Kohl's, this was a couple of years ago. Obviously they had data that they were the same customer, right? But who was benefiting from it the most? I'm not sure. But I think these new partnerships, they feel like win-wins because there's enough data about these consumers and how they've changed for them to be able to make these decisions, get more channels for the shop and shop, but have a distinct offering that nobody else has for the larger retailer.
Well, interestingly, Patrick or Andrew, we just had I guess it's for both you guys because you're both living and breathing this. We have a question specifically for Andrew. What did you think was the largest factor affecting return to retail? And Patrick, I'll ask you as well. From the poll question, there were 5 things: labor, workforce shortage, supply chain disruption, technology deployment, assortment planning, or fear of lingering COVID. Which do you think, Andrew, is the largest factor?
I think it was fulfillment. I think, here's studies where, the Amazon Prime shopper who was there before COVID might have done click list, right? And your bag is not filled with the poblano peppers you ordered, they were green peppers. And to have your spouse turn around and say, well, can you just go in the store anyway and get what I need? It's like, well, what's the point, right? So Amazon Prime shoppers actually started going in store because they were loyal to their brands. And then the new shoppers for Amazon Prime couldn't get where they were at, so they're trying to go in store. So I think fulfillment was the number one. And I think there's still this lingering COVID going on right now, especially with the spike. But you're seeing it's a state by state issue. I've been traveling in different states, and I've walked down an aisle in Massachusetts and had a woman scream at me, "You're walking the wrong way," right? But I could do the same thing traveling down through Tennessee to go to Florida and walk the store there. There's no arrows on the floor. There's nobody screaming. There's nobody wearing masks, right? Yeah. You're talking about Christmas time. So I think that's going to be more regional, the COVID issue. I think the fulfillment was obviously much more universal.
Patrick, what do you think?
So ultimately what I glean from Andrew, what you just said is it depends, right? And I'm gonna play off that as well. And Dave, I think it depends. If you're of my generation and you're used to, and granted, I'm in the industry, so I'm somewhat of a retail geek and I actually like going to stores, just ask my wife. For me, so at my age, the issue then becomes labor and my patience, okay? If there's a lack of labor and the experience isn't going to be good, then that's going to be a hindrance to me going back into stores. If you ask my kids who are, post-college, early adulting, living on their own, it's convenience. Like they're just conditioned to immediately go online. And whether it's Amazon or my daughter uses Instacart all the time in Atlanta and she is brand agnostic, which is a retailer's worst nightmare. She just looks at Instacart to be her solution. For them, it's convenience. So I think, David, ultimately depends on who you are, but I do have an underlying thesis, and I've been concerned about this for a very long time, and it ties back to frictionless checkout and what just walk out technology. I'm not going to reference the specific folks in Seattle and their technology, but let's call it that just walk out experience. My concern there, Dave, longer term, back to this idea of convenience and store labor, what I'm willing to put up with. I think over time, just like we expect faster internets, we want to see less buffering on our phone or our pads or our computer when a website's loading. I don't want buffering. I don't want delay. Over time, that just walk out technology is going to rewire us as to what we believe is acceptable. Okay. And I'm no longer going to be willing to stand in line. And that's where the just walk out technology is going to really make an impact. And that's where I think all retailers, regardless of channel, format, omni-choice, they're all going to have to think about, how do I enable that experience? Okay. Dave, you've heard my 24-word imperative. Give me an experience I can't get anywhere else. Save me 10 minutes or save me $10, make my day or change my life. That save me 10 minutes piece is real post-COVID. And so long answer, short question, Dave, I think it does depend, but it's going to be both store labor and convenience.
Yeah, and I guess if I had to answer the question, I would go first with store labor because I think it's there's a there's a huge challenge, obviously, and it could be, as a result of administrative pressures, it could be as a result of labor pool, it could be a result of other options, but there is a huge need for reskilling and retooling existing personnel to respond to this new shopper expectation. So that's my number one. But I'll tell you, similar to you, Patrick, if I ask my children who are young adults, they would say technology consistency or deployment. They don't want a different experience on their phone than they're getting in store, than they're getting online. They want consistency. They want to be able to pick up their phone and say, if it's available, guarantee it's going to be delivered to me. And there's nothing more frustrating to my 24-year-old than ordering something and then not getting what he thought he was going to get, those green peppers instead of red peppers, Andrew. Because he says this is unacceptable. And to your point, Patrick, that level of acceptance, that level of acceptability is a critical pivot point for our future. Well, speaking of our future, we are just about up at top of the hour. Andrew, I'm going to give you the last word, but I do want to remind all of our listeners, there's another InfoCast coming out October the 7th. I can't believe I'm talking about October already, but that is with a representative from A.T. Kearney and IdeoClick, and we're going to be talking about, Patrick's going to be discussing with them trends and shopper expectations around health and wellness. So I really look forward to that, whereas today was about brick and mortar. In October, we'll talk more about e-commerce. Andrew, words of wisdom from Cincinnati. What would you advise some of our retail partners to do immediately, and what are they missing as they look?
I wouldn't put a sign on the door that says shop us online. I don't think Disney can do that, by the way. So they need to fix their personnel issues. So I you have to look at, retail and expenditure for consumers, a little bump in consumer. We saw about 2 months ago, the numbers go back to pre-COVID levels. It was in combination of online and in store, but we saw it go back to pre-COVID levels. So that was really healthy. And so I just think retailers need to think bang for the buck, where are they going to be, and pay attention to these customer surveys. They are different, they are new. Unless you've been open the whole time and have all this data that's up to date, I would really think about these omni-choice strategies of how to rework your front end, have it there even for the future, even if it's going to dwindle down for a moment, because at some point you're going to need it again. I think that's the type of world we're in right now. So, strategize and bang for the buck, spend it where it counts. And I just worry about some of these investments are going to be way too expensive for the return. So.
Well, Andrew McQuilkin, it is always a pleasure to have a conversation with you. I don't think an hour is ever enough. And I would encourage those listening today or those listening to a recording later, seek out Andrew, seek out BHDP if you're looking for more insights about how to respond to this evolving shopper behavior. Patrick, it's a pleasure to be on this conference call in InfoCast with you. I always learn, and you are a great teacher.
Great to see you both. Dave and Andrew, thank you so much for your time today, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks to all who joined us today. I hope you have a great week, and please reach out if we can help grow your business in any way. Thanks, everyone.